Some people spend their whole lives pretending to be strong, only to discover that the smallest act of kindness can expose every crack in their heart. Lorenzo De Luca had built an empire where every promise was verified, every smile was questioned, and every person was quietly measured before being trusted. At 40 years old, the white-haired whispers of experience had not touched him yet, but the weight in his blue eyes belonged to a man decades older. Wealth had bought him comfort, influence, and silence, but it had never bought certainty. Every employee inside the sprawling Connecticut estate knew one unspoken rule. Mr. De Luca noticed everything. Every misplaced vase, every nervous glance, every dishonest excuse. That was why, when Amara Johnson arrived 6 months earlier with her 3-year-old son Elijah, nobody expected them to last. She was a 34-year-old black maid with calm eyes, gentle manners, and the quiet confidence of someone who had survived enough disappointment to stop announcing her pain. She never complained when extra work appeared. She never asked for favors. Every morning before sunrise, she crossed the enormous marble foyer, holding Elijah's tiny hand before dropping him at the small playroom prepared for staff children. Somehow the little boy never cried when she left. He simply waved with a bright smile and whispered the same words every morning. "I'll be brave, Mommy." Lorenzo noticed that too. He noticed Elijah thanking cooks for apple slices, greeting gardeners by name, carefully placing toys back where he found them, and hugging the old golden retriever before saying goodnight as though the aging dog were family. It was almost too perfect. Lorenzo had spent his life watching adults rehearse kindness whenever someone important entered the room. He had seen polished manners disappear the moment nobody was looking. Children, however, reflected whatever truth lived inside the home. Or so he believed. Yet something about Elijah unsettled him. The boy never seemed aware that anyone was watching. That made Lorenzo suspicious instead of impressed. Was Amara coaching him? Were those innocent smiles another carefully rehearsed performance meant to secure a comfortable future? Questions like that lingered longer than they should have. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, sunlight spilled across the library windows while the estate rested in unusual silence. Most of the household staff had finished their duties, and the ticking grandfather clock echoed through polished walnut shelves lined with leather-bound books. Lorenzo removed his reading glasses, stretched across the long sofa, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed until it sounded deep and even. Anyone passing by would assume he had drifted into a peaceful nap after lunch. But behind those closed eyelids, every sense remained alert. It was not exhaustion that kept him motionless. It was intention. He wanted to know who Elijah truly was when no reward waited, when no mother reminded him to behave, when no wealthy employer could offer approval. Soft footsteps approached across the hardwood floor. They were too light to belong to an adult. Lorenzo resisted every instinct to open his eyes. The silent experiment had begun, although he could not possibly imagine that before the next few minutes were over, the person whose heart would be tested was never the little boy at all. Elijah stopped just a few feet from the sofa, his tiny sneakers making almost no sound against the polished hardwood floor. For several long seconds, he simply stood there, tilting his head as he studied Lorenzo's peaceful face with the quiet curiosity only a child could possess. There was no fear in his expression and no excitement at finding himself alone inside the grand library that every member of the household treated with careful respect. His small brown eyes wandered across the room instead. Sunlight poured through towering windows, warming the rows of books, the polished globe in the corner, and the crackling fireplace that had long since faded into glowing embers. On the side table rested a porcelain teacup, half full and forgotten beside an open novel. Elijah looked back at Lorenzo and whispered so softly that even the silence almost swallowed the words. "Mommy says people sleep better when everything is peaceful." Lorenzo remained perfectly still. Every muscle in his body wanted to react, but years of discipline kept him motionless. He heard the child take several careful steps away. A chair scraped gently across the Persian rug. Then another faint sound followed as little hands gathered several colorful wooden blocks that someone had forgotten to return to the playroom. Instead of stacking them where he stood, Elijah carried them one at a time to a woven basket across the room. He worked with complete concentration, occasionally pausing to balance himself as the oversized basket reached almost to his shoulders. When the last block disappeared inside, He smiled to himself with quiet satisfaction, not because anyone praised him, but because the room simply looked nicer. Lorenzo listened closely. No applause. No audience. No reward. Only silence. The little boy wandered toward the window where the golden retriever slept beneath a patch of afternoon sunlight. Elijah knelt beside the old dog and gently stroked its gray muzzle. "You have to be quiet too," he whispered. "Mr. Lorenzo is resting." The aging dog lifted its head for only a moment before settling down again, as though it understood every word. Elijah giggled under his breath, but immediately covered his own mouth with both hands after realizing he had made noise. "Oops," he murmured. "Sorry." Lorenzo felt something unfamiliar tug at the edge of his carefully guarded thoughts. Nothing about the child's behavior felt rehearsed. Children who performed for adults usually checked to see if someone was watching. Elijah never once looked toward the sofa. He behaved the same way whether anyone noticed or not. A few moments later, tiny footsteps approached again. Lorenzo sensed the child standing beside him once more. He could almost feel those curious eyes studying the faint lines on his face. Then came a tiny sigh, followed by the sound of fabric moving. Elijah disappeared for only a few seconds before returning with a soft, knitted throw folded clumsily over both arms. The blanket was obviously too large for someone his size. He struggled to lift it high enough, stretching onto his tiptoes before finally draping it across Lorenzo's legs. One corner slipped onto the floor. Elijah frowned with determined concentration, bent down, picked it up, and tried again until the blanket rested neatly across him. "There," he whispered proudly. "Mommy says people get cold when they sleep." Lorenzo felt the warmth of the blanket settle over him, but something far deeper began settling inside his heart, something he had not expected to encounter when he decided to test a little boy who had absolutely no idea that anyone was measuring the quiet goodness hidden inside his small, generous soul. Elijah stepped back to admire the blanket one last time before quietly climbing onto the wide window seat overlooking the gardens. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the maple trees, sending scattered leaves dancing across the stone pathways. He watched them with the fascinated silence that only very young children seemed able to master. After a minute, he noticed a small framed photograph resting on the nearby bookshelf. It showed a smiling little girl, perhaps 5 years old, holding a bright yellow kite beneath a summer sky. Elijah carefully picked up the frame with both hands, studying it as though he had discovered a hidden treasure. "She looks happy," he whispered to himself. Lorenzo's heartbeat slowed. Almost nobody touched that photograph. Most visitors never even noticed it. The little girl had been his niece, the brightest light in his family before illness had taken her years earlier. Since then, the picture had remained exactly where it was, untouched except when the housekeepers dusted around it. Elijah looked toward the sleeping man on the sofa, then back at the photograph. "Maybe she is in heaven," he said softly. "Mommy says people who love big never really leave." His tiny fingers brushed a speck of dust from the edge of the frame before he placed it back exactly where he had found it. There was no childish carelessness, only surprising gentleness. A few moments later, the old grandfather clock chimed the half hour. The deep sound echoed through the library, causing the golden retriever to lift its head again. Elijah immediately raised one finger to his lips. "Shoo," he whispered with complete sincerity. "He is still sleeping." Even the dog seemed to settle back down. Lorenzo remained perfectly still, yet the walls he had built around himself over decades began to feel strangely fragile. He had expected curiosity. He had expected childish mischief. He had even prepared himself for broken decorations or fingerprints on priceless antiques. Instead, he found himself listening to a little boy protecting another person's rest as though it were the most natural responsibility in the world. Elijah suddenly remembered something. He hurried toward the doorway before stopping halfway. Looking back at Lorenzo, he hesitated. Then he walked to the side table, picked up the half-finished teacup with both hands, frowned thoughtfully, and quietly carried it into the adjoining sitting room where a serving tray rested on the counter. The cup rattled gently as he lowered it with extraordinary care. "Mommy says dirty dishes should not wait," he explained to no one in particular. Returning to the library, he noticed a hardcover book lying open with several pages slightly bent beneath its own weight. He had often watched Amara place bookmarks inside the library books she borrowed from the local public library on weekends. Trying to imitate her, Elijah searched the nearby table until he found a plain ribbon that had slipped from another volume. With slow, deliberate movements, he tucked the ribbon between the open pages and carefully closed the book. "Books like to rest too," he whispered with a satisfied smile. Lorenzo felt an unfamiliar ache settle in his chest. None of these moments could have been rehearsed. They were too ordinary, too quiet, too deeply rooted in habits that belonged inside a loving home. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering not what kind of employee Amara Johnson was, but what kind of mother could raise a child whose goodness appeared even when he believed the entire world was asleep. The library settled into an even deeper silence, the kind that seemed to slow time itself. Elijah folded his little hands on his lap and watched the dancing dust floating through the shafts of afternoon sunlight. After several peaceful minutes, a faint cough escaped Lorenzo's throat, small enough that most adults might have ignored it. Elijah did not. His head turned immediately toward the sofa, concern replacing his quiet smile. He slid down from the window seat and hurried over without making more noise than necessary. Standing beside Lorenzo again, he studied the man's face with innocent seriousness. "Maybe he is getting sick," he whispered. "Mommy says people need water when they cough." His eyes searched the room until they found a crystal pitcher resting on the sideboard. It was far too heavy for someone his size, so he did not try to lift it. Instead, he carefully picked up a small glass that had already been filled earlier in the day. Holding it with both hands, he shuffled slowly across the room, concentrating so hard that not a single drop spilled over the rim. When he reached the sofa, he looked at the sleeping man, then quietly placed the glass on the nearby table where it would be easy to reach after waking. "There," he murmured. "Now you do not have to look for it." Lorenzo felt every word settle into the silence around him. He had expected temptation. He had expected curiosity. Instead, he found thoughtful preparation for another person's comfort. Elijah noticed that one corner of the blanket had slipped away again. He stretched on his tiptoes, tugging gently until it covered Lorenzo's shoulder. Satisfied, he gave a tiny nod. Then he looked toward the ceiling as though thinking very hard about something important. "Mommy says everybody misses somebody," he whispered. "Even grown-ups." The sentence lingered in the room long after the words faded. Lorenzo felt a tightening deep inside his chest that had nothing to do with age or fatigue. There were memories he had locked away so completely that even his closest friends never mentioned them. Yet somehow, this little boy, without knowing anything about his life, had wandered dangerously close to truths he had buried years before. Elijah quietly climbed onto the rug beside the sofa and crossed his little legs. He reached into the pocket of his tiny blue sweater and pulled out a worn red crayon with only half its paper wrapper remaining. Next came a folded sheet of construction, paper that had clearly been colored many times before. Resting the paper on the floor, he began drawing with complete concentration. Slow circles became a bright yellow sun. Green lines became grass. A large square house appeared beside two smiling stick figures holding hands. Finally, he drew a third figure standing slightly apart before carefully connecting everyone with oversized hearts. When he finished, he smiled proudly at his own work. "Nobody should be by themselves," he said softly. He folded the picture once, stood up, and tucked it beneath the edge of the blanket where Lorenzo would easily discover it after waking. "That is for you," he whispered. "Pictures help people smile." Then, believing his work was done, Elijah quietly walked toward the doorway to look for his mother, completely unaware that the greatest test taking place inside that silent library no longer belonged to a 3-year-old child. It belonged to a man whose carefully guarded heart had begun to surrender to simple kindness one quiet moment at a time. Elijah had almost reached the hallway when he suddenly stopped, as though an important thought had quietly found him. He turned back toward the sleeping man, looked around the enormous library one more time, and slowly walked back to the sofa. Lorenzo remained perfectly still, but every sense focused on the tiny footsteps drawing closer again. The little boy studied his face for several long seconds before kneeling beside the sofa. "Mommy says sometimes people smile on the outside because they do not want anybody to know they are sad," he whispered. "Maybe that is you." The words settled into the room with astonishing simplicity. No accusation, no pity, Only the honest observation of a child who had listened carefully to his mother's quiet lessons. Elijah folded his tiny hands together. His eyes closed. His voice became almost too soft to hear. Dear God, please help Mr. Lorenzo. If his heart hurts, please make it feel better. If he is lonely, please send him somebody nice to eat dinner with. If he misses someone, please tell them he still loves them. Mommy says you hear little prayers too, so I think you can hear me. Lorenzo felt the air leave his lungs, but he forced himself not to move. Every carefully constructed wall inside him seemed to crack a little wider with each innocent sentence. Elijah opened his eyes and looked toward the family photograph resting on the bookshelf. And if that little girl is with you, maybe she can tell Mr. Lorenzo goodnight when he feels scared. Lorenzo's fingers twitched beneath the blanket before becoming still again. Nobody in the household knew why that photograph remained in the library. Amara had never asked. Elijah could not possibly know its story. Yet somehow his childish imagination had wandered directly into the deepest room of Lorenzo's memories. The little boy carefully reached beneath the edge of the blanket and adjusted the folded drawing one last time so it would not slide onto the floor. Do not forget your picture, he whispered with a smile. It is happier when somebody keeps it. Just then, soft footsteps echoed from the hallway. Elijah. Amara called gently. Sweetheart, where are you? I am in the library, Mommy, he answered in the same quiet voice. Mr. Lorenzo is sleeping, so I used my whisper. Amara appeared in the doorway carrying a basket of freshly folded towels. The moment she noticed her son beside the sofa, concern crossed her face. She hurried over, lowering her voice immediately. Honey, I told you not to disturb Mr. DeLuca while he is resting. Elijah looked up with innocent surprise. I did not disturb him. I made everything quieter. Amara noticed the neatly folded blanket, the glass of water placed within easy reach, the books arranged carefully on the table, and the drawing tucked beneath the edge of the throw. Her expression softened. She crouched beside her son and gently brushed a curl away from his forehead. Were you helping? Elijah nodded proudly. Because sleeping people still need somebody to care about them. Amara smiled, kissed the top of his head, and whispered, That was very thoughtful, baby, but kindness is never something we do so people will notice. We do it because it is the right thing, even if nobody ever knows. Elijah smiled back. I know, Mommy, as she took his small hand and quietly led him toward the hallway. Neither of them looked back at the sofa. They believed they were leaving behind a man peacefully asleep. They never imagined that every gentle word, every small act, and every lesson spoken between a mother and her son had been heard by the one person whose life was beginning to change forever. Lorenzo waited until the sound of their footsteps disappeared into the distant hallway before finally opening his eyes. For a long moment, he did not move at all. The library looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, yet nothing inside it felt familiar anymore. The blanket still rested across his shoulders with awkward little folds that only a child's hands could have made. The glass of water reflected the afternoon sunlight beside him. Slowly, he reached beneath the edge of the blanket and discovered the folded drawing. His fingers hesitated before opening it. A bright yellow sun stretched across the page above a small house surrounded by green grass. 3 smiling figures stood together with oversized red hearts connecting them, while a 4th figure who had been standing alone was gently drawn into the circle. On the bottom, written in uneven letters that clearly belonged to someone still learning the alphabet, were 4 simple words. Nobody eats alone ever. Lorenzo stared at the page until the colors blurred. His mind drifted backward through years he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He remembered sitting alone at long dining tables after losing people he loved, convincing himself that work was easier than grief and that success was safer than attachment. The mansion had grown larger every year, yet somehow the silence inside it had grown even larger. He had filled empty rooms with priceless artwork, rare books, and polished antiques, but none of them had ever spoken to the loneliness waiting for him each evening. A 3-year-old boy had seen it within minutes. The realization settled heavily inside him. He had spent weeks quietly evaluating Amara, believing he was studying her character through careful observation. He had assumed kindness could be rehearsed, respect could be performed, and affection could be exchanged for security. But children did not invent values on their own. They carried whatever was practiced inside the home every single day. Elijah had never once looked around to see whether anyone admired his actions. He had not expected praise. He had not searched for approval. He simply believed that caring for another person was the normal way to live. Lorenzo lowered the drawing onto his lap and closed his eyes once more, though this time there was no pretending. A single tear escaped before he noticed it. Then another followed. He did not wipe them away. There was nobody in the room to impress, nobody whose opinion mattered at that moment except his own. For years he had believed strength meant never allowing sorrow to reach the surface. Now he wondered whether real strength had been quietly demonstrated by a little boy carrying a glass of water with both hands because he did not want a stranger to wake up thirsty. A soft knock interrupted the silence. His longtime butler, Charles, stepped carefully into the library. The older gentleman stopped immediately after seeing Lorenzo sitting quietly with the colorful drawing resting in his hands. During nearly 20 years of service, Charles had witnessed business triumphs, personal losses, and countless formal gatherings, but he had almost never seen genuine emotion on his employer's face. "Sir," Charles asked gently, "is everything all right?" Lorenzo looked down at the drawing one more time before answering with a voice quieter than Charles had ever heard. "No," he admitted honestly. "Everything was not all right until a little boy walked into this room and reminded me what I had forgotten." The conversation with Charles lingered in Lorenzo's mind long after the butler quietly excused himself. The colorful drawing remained in his hands while the afternoon sun slowly shifted across the library floor, painting long golden lines through the room that had suddenly begun to feel less like a monument to success and more like a place waiting to become a home again. Lorenzo rose from the sofa and walked toward the wide window overlooking the gardens where he spotted Amara in the distance. She was kneeling beside Elijah near a flower bed, patiently helping him gather fallen leaves into a small basket instead of letting him scatter them across the lawn. Every few moments the little boy proudly held up another leaf, and Amara smiled as though he had discovered hidden treasure. She never hurried him. She never corrected him with impatience. She simply listened, encouraged, and thanked him for helping. Lorenzo realized something that had escaped him for months. She treated her son with the very same respect she offered every person inside the estate, whether they were executives, gardeners, cooks, or delivery drivers. Kindness was not a performance she turned on when someone important appeared. It was the language she lived by every single day. Later that afternoon, Lorenzo found himself walking through the staff wing for the first time in years without announcing his visit. The hallway was simple, clean, and modest compared with the grand rooms of the main house. As he passed the small break room, he heard Elijah's cheerful voice floating through the partially open door. Curious, Lorenzo stopped without making a sound. The little boy sat beside his mother at a tiny wooden table, sharing a peanut butter sandwich cut into uneven squares. Before taking his own bite, Elijah carefully pushed the larger half toward Amara. "You take the big one," he said. "You worked harder today." Amara smiled gently and slid the sandwich back toward him. "We share," she answered. Without another word, Elijah tore both pieces apart until they were almost exactly the same size. "Now it is fair," he declared happily. Lorenzo felt another quiet ache settle inside his chest. There were no expensive toys on the table, no lavish meals, no extraordinary comforts. Yet there was laughter, gratitude, patience, and a sense of peace that money alone had never purchased. As Lorenzo turned to leave, he noticed Charles standing farther down the hallway with a knowing expression. The older man smiled softly before speaking. "Sir, may I tell you something I have wanted to say for quite some time?" Lorenzo nodded. Charles folded his hands behind his back. "Some people impress others because they possess great wealth, others because they possess great talent. But once in a very long while, someone enters a place carrying nothing except a gentle heart, and somehow everyone around them becomes better without realizing why." Lorenzo looked back toward the break room where Amara laughed quietly after Elijah accidentally placed a paper napkin on his own head and declared himself a fancy gentleman. The sound echoed through the hallway with effortless joy. For the first time in many years, Lorenzo understood that he had never truly been searching for loyal employees or perfect manners. Deep inside, he had been searching for proof that simple goodness still existed in the world. He had thought he was testing a child. Instead, a child had quietly revealed everything that was missing from the life of a man who had once believed he already possessed everything. The following Monday morning, the mansion awoke to routines that seemed unchanged, yet something subtle had shifted beneath the polished surface. Lorenzo arrived in the dining room earlier than usual, carrying the folded drawing inside the pocket of his suit jacket instead of locking it away in a drawer. He had looked at it more than a dozen times over the weekend, each glance reminding him that genuine kindness did not announce itself with grand speeches. It revealed itself in ordinary moments that most people overlooked. As breakfast was being prepared, Amara quietly entered to dust the bookshelves lining the room. Elijah sat nearby at a small table coloring animals inside a worn activity book while humming softly to himself. Neither of them noticed Lorenzo standing in the doorway. They behaved exactly as they always had. Amara greeted every cook by name, thanked the kitchen staff for their hard work, and reminded Elijah to place his crayons back into the box after using them because, as she gently explained, the next child should find everything ready too. Lorenzo listened without interrupting. There was no audience worth impressing, no wealthy guest watching from across the room, and yet every lesson she taught reflected the same quiet values he had witnessed in the library. Finally, he stepped inside. Both Amara and Elijah immediately looked up. "Good morning, Mr. DeLuca," Amara said with her usual calm professionalism. Elijah smiled brightly and waved with a tiny hand. "Good morning." Lorenzo returned the greeting with a warmth that surprised even himself. "Good morning, Elijah." The little boy's eyes widened for just a moment. It was the first time Lorenzo had ever addressed him by name. Amara noticed it too, although she politely said nothing. Lorenzo walked toward the table and placed the folded drawing in front of Elijah. "I believe this belongs to you," he said gently. Elijah looked confused before recognizing the colorful picture. "You found it," he said happily. "Did it make you smile?" Lorenzo paused, feeling the simple question reach far deeper than the child could possibly understand. "Yes," he answered honestly. "More than you know." Elijah grinned with complete satisfaction, tucked the drawing back into his activity book, and returned to coloring without expecting another word. The conversation was already finished in his mind. He had offered a gift simply because he wanted someone else to feel happier. Watching him, Lorenzo realized that children who were taught generosity never waited for applause. They simply moved on to the next opportunity to care for someone. Before leaving for the day, Lorenzo quietly asked Amara if she could spare a few minutes in his study after lunch. Anxiety briefly crossed her face despite her composed expression. She searched her memory for mistakes she might have made, wondering whether she had overlooked a task or accidentally broken some household rule. When the appointed time arrived, she knocked softly on the study door. Lorenzo invited her inside and motioned toward the chair across from his desk. Instead of remaining behind the large mahogany desk that had always separated employer from employee, he carried his own chair forward until they sat at the same distance from one another. Amara noticed the unexpected gesture immediately. Lorenzo folded his hands for a moment before speaking. "There is something I owe you," he said quietly. "Not because of your work, which has always been excellent, but because of something far more important. I owe you my gratitude for raising a little boy who reminded me that the greatest measure of a person's character is how they treat someone who can offer them nothing in return." Amara lowered her eyes for a moment, clearly surprised by Lorenzo's words. During the 6 months she had worked in the mansion, she had expected instructions, corrections, and professional conversations, but never gratitude. She smiled gently before answering in the same calm voice that had become so familiar throughout the estate. "Thank you, Mr. DeLuca, but Elijah only repeats what he sees at home. I tell him every night that kindness is free, respect costs nothing, and every person deserves both." Lorenzo nodded slowly. For the first time in years, he realized that the most valuable lesson ever spoken inside his home had not come from a business partner, a celebrated author, or a respected mentor. It had come from a hardworking mother whose greatest achievement would never appear on a resume. A few days later, the entire household noticed quiet changes. The formal employee dining room received new windows that filled the space with warm afternoon light. A small reading corner appeared beside the playroom for staff children, stocked with colorful books and comfortable chairs. Fresh flowers began appearing on the tables every Monday morning. No announcements were made. No speeches explained the improvements. They simply became part of everyday life. When Charles asked why the renovations had been approved so quickly, Lorenzo answered with a thoughtful smile. Because people give their best when they know they matter. The greatest surprise arrived the following Saturday. Lorenzo invited every member of the household staff and their families to a simple afternoon picnic on the estate grounds. Instead of long banquet tables and formal seating arrangements, blankets covered the green lawn beneath towering oak trees. Children laughed while chasing bubbles through the sunshine. Gardeners played catch with cooks. Housekeepers shared homemade desserts with drivers and maintenance workers. Titles disappeared for a few peaceful hours, replaced by conversations, smiles, and genuine connection. Elijah ran across the grass holding a bright yellow kite that refused to stay in the air for more than a few seconds. Each time it landed, he laughed even harder before trying again. Eventually, the kite drifted toward Lorenzo's feet. The little boy hurried over, slightly out of breath, and looked up with hopeful eyes. "Would you help me?" he asked. Lorenzo accepted the string without hesitation. Together they walked across the open field until a gentle breeze finally lifted the kite high into the clear blue sky. Elijah clapped with delight. "You did it." Lorenzo smiled and quietly shook his head. "No, Elijah, we did it." Nearby, Amara watched the scene with grateful eyes, understanding that something important had changed even though she still knew nothing about the quiet afternoon in the library. She had never discovered the pretend nap, the whispered prayer, or the drawing tucked beneath the blanket. She only saw a man who had become softer without losing his dignity, and a little boy who continued treating everyone with the same uncomplicated kindness he offered every day. That evening, after the guests had gone home and the mansion grew peaceful once more, Lorenzo returned to the library. He placed Elijah's drawing inside a simple wooden frame and set it beside the photograph that had remained alone for so many years. Looking at both pictures together, he smiled through grateful eyes and whispered words meant only for himself. "I thought I was testing a child, but the child revealed the man I still wanted to become." And from that quiet day forward, everyone who entered the DeLuca estate could feel a difference they could not quite explain. Because sometimes the greatest transformations begin not with power, wealth, or influence, but with the gentle heart of a little child who believes that nobody should ever eat alone, nobody should ever be forgotten, and kindness should always be given even when no one is watching.